let's answer the second question first. The answer is yes. What the government decides to do, if anything, about a monopoly to compel it to behave in an allocatively efficient way does depend on why the firm is a monopoly in the first place, or which basically boils down to what kinds of barriers to entry are in place that sustain the monopoly. If the monopoly exists because of government-created barriers, say, for example, certain kinds of zoning laws, then the government could, for example, simply change those zoning laws so that new firms can move into a certain geographical area and compete with an existing firm. If the barriers to entry are firm created, say for example, if a firm has made itself dominant by means of predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is a practice where a firm will charge a price that's so low that the firm itself is potentially making a loss, but it's doing so in order to, and in the hope of, making it extremely undesirable for any new firm to enter the market, and presumably to kill off by bankrupting potential rivals who can't match the same low price. So if that's, for example, a barrier to entry, that there's this particularly aggressive firm which engages in predatory pricing, the government could simply make predatory pricing illegal and thereby solve that problem, remove that barrier to entry. Incidentally, in Australia, predatory pricing is illegal. But what about the hairdressing example that we've looked at in the previous videos? So, if we think of, try and think of a case where a hairdresser would be a monopoly, we're probably thinking, for example, of a small country town. Now, in small country towns, it's very often the case that you only have one of everything. So you've got one petrol station, one pub, one supermarket, one hairdresser, one baker, and so on. Now, in that case, you've got all of these little monopolies. Obviously, they're not giant corporations, but they are monopolies because there's not sufficient demand in the small town to sustain, say, 2 or more hairdressers, or 2 or more petrol stations, 2 or more pubs, or something like that. So this might be a case of a natural monopoly. Now, if it's in the case of, so, a natural monopoly in a small town for hairdressers, we might say, well, what probably would happen is that the government won't do anything. It's not of sufficient importance. But, nonetheless, let's think it through. What are the possibilities for the government? One is that the government could impose a price ceiling at the allocatively efficient price. So the profit maximising price is $14. The government could simply say, well, it's now illegal to charge $14. You now must charge around about $12. That is the allocatively efficient price. So you can't go above the price ceiling of $12. Now, in that case, if $12 is the highest price that this little hairdressing monopoly can charge, then it will be in its interests then to choose the output where the price equals the marginal cost, which will be the allocatively efficient output. So that's one way of the government intervening in the market to create an allocatively efficient outcome. Alternatively, the government could, in theory anyway, impose a production quota on the hairdresser that requires it to produce at the allocatively efficient output. So it simply mandates that you must produce 4 haircuts per hour, right, rather than 3 haircuts per hour. Now, in order to achieve that goal, the firm is going to have to lower its price. Otherwise, it won't meet its quota, its mandated quota. So it lowers the price to $12 per haircut so that there will be sufficient quantity demanded to meet the quota. That's another possible way of achieving an allocatively efficient outcome. Another possibility, which is, well, they're all kind of odd in the case of the hairdresser, but what could happen is that the government could give a subsidy to the hairdresser to lower its costs, so that when it factors in this subsidy, it's profit maximizing for the firm to produce at the allocatively efficient output. So if a subsidy is given so that the firm's marginal cost falls by the value of the subsidy, then it could fall to a point where we get this, like that. So, where's the optimal output for the firm now? Where marginal revenue equals marginal cost at this new lower marginal cost which has been subsidized. So, it's 4 units of 4 haircuts per hour, and it will simply charge the highest price consumers are willing to pay for the 4 haircuts, which is $12. Voila! Allocative efficiency achieved, at least within this particular market. We need to bear in mind that in this particular case, the subsidy had to be paid for somehow. Presumably, the government would have had to tax buyers and sellers in some other market in order to raise the revenue to provide the subsidy to the hairdresser in this market. So by imposing a tax in another market, you create an allocatively inefficient outcome in order to provide a subsidy in this market to achieve an allocatively efficient outcome here. So you're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. It's not necessarily going to produce an overall improvement. You need to look at the other markets, which we don't show here, which have been affected by the imposition of a tax to fund this subsidy. Lucky last, the government could, and this may seem slightly weird in the case of hairdressers, but the government could nationalise and command that an allocatively efficient price and quantity were produced by hairdressers. So this would be the seemingly odd case of the government either purchasing hairdressers and then running them, or forcibly acquiring them and then running them. Either way, the government would then administer the pricing and output of hairdressers. They might calculate what would be the allocatively efficient price and quantity. Once they've estimated that, they simply will then command that the hairdresser workers charge the allocatively efficient price of $12 and produce 4 haircuts per hour. This seems obviously weird and that would never happen in the real world. Actually, it did happen in the real world. So there were places in the Soviet Union where people who worked in hairdressing salons, they didn't own the hairdressing salons, they were simply workers in it. And the entire hairdressing industry was administered by a ministry. I think it was the Ministry of Municipal Economies, I think it was, that sought to set prices and allocate resources to produce a sufficient number of haircuts. So it's not as if it's inconceivable, but it's pretty unlikely in the case of Australia. Okay, so all of these examples that we've looked at are obviously probably never going to be, or never would be contemplated as being implemented in Australia. But nonetheless, the basic ideas could be applied to industries or firms, in particular monopolies, which might be regarded as particularly important. So, for example, if the supply of water were privatised and you had a private monopoly, then the government might seriously consider maintaining price controls or imposing quotas, as it actually does now. There's price caps on water and there are quotas on water, and those quotas change depending on how much rain there is. So it's not as if these ideas are inconceivable. It just means that it's a question, largely a political and also a practical question, about whether any of these kinds of interventions would or should be imposed on particular monopolies, depending on how important they are to, quote-unquote, the nation.